It's been just a few days since Tim Keller went to be with his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. A pastor, writer, and theologian, Keller has had a profound impact on so many during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. I, for one, have been blessed by Keller's ministry. Today, I'm going to converse with some youth ministry friends about the life, impact, and legacy of Tim Keller and what it means for all of us moving forward on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, welcome everybody to an episode of Youth Culture Matters, a new episode here that I'm very excited about. I know that the prompt for this is one that I think leaves many of us grieving, although we grieve with great hope, as just a few days ago, Tim Keller, who most of our listeners are aware of, went to be with Christ, and he talked a lot about suffering, about death. He suffered with pancreatic cancer for quite some time. The Lord was gracious in giving him some years to do some more ministry and do some more writing. We'll talk some about that. But as we think about Keller, I thought it would be a good idea to get a couple of my youth ministry friends together just to reflect back on Keller's life and specifically on some of his influences. We'll get to that in just a couple of minutes. That's what we want to really focus on here in the podcast. But I do want to introduce the two guys who are with me today. First off, Kyle Hofsmith. Kyle, welcome. Most of our folks know you from the Word and Youth
good
Ministry
to be here this morning.
Podcast here. Kyle's at Old North Church in Canfield, Ohio. I said to him, he looks a little bit weary this morning. He had that. You went over that great hump last night that youth workers. What was that? Just
we
your last.
We went over the last Wednesday night of the school year, which is the only thing I've inherited in my current church that I'm not a huge fan of, but I still do. And that is, we call it messy games. So last night we had a bunch of teenagers here, and it was basically a large food fight that ends in a slip and slide that ended in the completion of my 10th year of being a youth pastor. So God is kind. And I was happy to take a shower last night and be here talking about Tim Keller today.
Yeah, I know. I said to you, when you hit that hump, I know how that is. You finish something big, right? And you hit a transition point, and you start to let down a little bit. I think the Lord just gets us ready for rest. So I hope you get that, Kyle. I know you got a busy day, so I'm glad you joined us. And then Jason Engels. Jason Engels with us from North Carolina. Jason, go ahead, tell us a little bit about yourself. I think some folks are familiar with you.
Hey, Walt, it's an honor to be here. I serve at Westwood Baptist Church in Roxborough, North Carolina. That's north central North Carolina. Been here for 17 years. And Kyle, it's funny, you say you just finished your 10th, and I am in my 20th. So that made me feel old, and I appreciate that. We just finished up our kind of year of student worship as well, and looking forward to kicking off the summer, but happy to be here with you today.
Yeah, so I got to know Jason. Jason was a part of one of our Faith and Culture cohorts that we were doing by Zoom here, and then we met face-to-face last, when was it? Well, it was November, right?
November,
November down in Atlanta. Duffy Robbins and myself, we had one of our symposiums on traditional biblical sexuality and a changing youth culture, which is always a very fruitful time. We're actually going to do one of those in November again of this year, 2023, so stay tuned on that. But Jason was there, part of that crew around that table where we had some extremely provocative and fruitful instruction that I know for everybody there has yielded some great fruit. But also, Jason, you're part of something brand new here at CPYU that we're very excited about, a dream I've had for years and years, and that is our brand new CPYU Research Fellows program. You're one of 12 that's a part of that crew. I don't know if you want to let people in on just what that is and the kinds of things you folks will be doing.
Yeah, so it's a great honor to be a part of that. And The symposium too, I'll say that if anyone out there is interested in going, you really should. It was just a great time and a wonderful opportunity to sit around the table with like-minded brothers and sisters and really talk about an area of great difficulty that we face in ministry. And I know I came away feeling much more confident in addressing those issues here at my church and beyond that. But the Research Fellow program, I'm really looking forward to. Walt, your resources that you guys put out have just been really helpful and encouraging for us here at our church, for parents especially. And I know that you brought us in to kind of take some of the load of writing some of that material and putting some of that those resources out, and gives us an opportunity to explore that, to kind of develop that craft of researching and writing, and gives us a platform to be able to share some of the things that are on our hearts as well. And we're really looking forward to being a part of that.
Yeah. Well, we're excited you're there, and I know it's going to be fun to see what you guys come up with. It's great. It's already been great working with you all. So, by the way, the outlet for that is our website, cpyu.org, and our website was just redone, relaunched. We've still got maybe a couple things, Chris, to tweak on there. Chris Wagner's been working very hard on that for months. And do you want to say something about the website, Chris, just to let folks know what they can find there and maybe a little bit about how it's changed?
Sure. Yeah, we relaunched our website at the beginning of May, and we're really excited about it. Much more user-friendly. We hope that the resources that we do have available are much easier for you guys to find. We just updated the functionality. It's mobile friendly. All the all the standards technology-wise that have changed since we last redid our website. We've tried to be up to date with all that kind of stuff so that you can access it mobilely and all those things. But our goal is really, obviously, we want you to be able to access our resources and find them easier. So everything from how the search function works to how the resources are organized and being able to find them in an easier spot. That was our goal. But, of course, we're still making tweaks behind the scenes. And so if you guys have feedback for us, we welcome that. You can send feedback to cpyu@cpyu.org and let us know, if there's things on the website you're not sure about, or you things you love, things you don't love. There's still time to make some changes. So we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and you can access, it's kind of fun to scroll down through there. You can access our 3 podcasts, Youth Culture Matters, The Word in Youth Ministry, and our daily 1-minute Youth Culture Today. They're right there on the homepage. There's a player. You can listen to those, and you can access the archives as well. By the way,
yeah,
Kyle,
and Walt, I just want to mention quickly for our listeners, my favorite part of our website is down, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a section called In the News. And one thing that Chris does really well for anyone who goes to the website is takes a collection of different articles that are found online and puts them there about youth culture, about technology. I would just recommend, especially for pastors and youth leaders who are looking for information to use as illustrations in sermons that can connect with parents. I think it's one of our best kept secrets.
Yeah.
So it looks beautiful on the new website.
Yeah, I can't thank Chris enough. I come in here and I see him just sweating as he's working on this stuff. And
is he sweating because he's working, or because the air conditioning doesn't work in the summer?
No, he's sweating because there's like hurdles to go over. If you ever remember, like in if you ran track, or if you didn't run track, like me, I was a thrower in track. They called it the weight team. So when I would have gym class and we'd have to run the hurdles, I wouldn't sleep for 3 days before then because I knew it was just going to be brutal. And I think it's like Chris with hurdles here, some of these tough things to get over. You're just, am I going to make it over that? But he's done a great job with that. So good. Well, I want to switch the conversation here to what we're really here to talk about, and that is the life and the legacy of Tim Keller and the influences on him. And I have either of you guys ever had the opportunity? I know you've heard Keller a lot, and I'm guessing, have both of you heard Keller in person over the years?
Mm-hmm.
Kyle,
I never got the opportunity to. I wish I had, but never did.
Yeah, but the good news is on that is just about everything he's ever done has been recorded, and you can find it on YouTube and elsewhere.
That's right.
And we're gonna mention some of those things. By the way, Chris, get your pen ready, because there are so many things we are going to talk about today that you're going to have to link to in the show notes. I'll help you out with this afterwards, but I didn't even warn you yet. But
I'm ready.
So many names, so many books, so many great resources. Kyle, you've had a chance to hear him, right?
Yeah, I heard him at the Gospel Coalition several times. I remember the first time I heard him was at the Gospel Coalition National Conference. I think it was 2015 or somewhere around then. But I remember he was sick, and here he is, the co-founder of the Gospel Coalition, and he's sick, but he still preached. And I remember them saying that, like, 10% Tim Keller up there preaching is still worth him preaching. But one thing I loved about hearing him in person is he was doing two things. He was modeling what expositional teaching was, but he was also training those who were present in how to do it. And I just remember, whenever you get to go to these conferences and hear people preach, not to honor them as celebrities, but to honor them as men of God who are preaching. It's always fun to know that, this day was coming, and, he wasn't even sick at that point, but now he'll never preach in a pulpit again. But it was fun to be able to hear him in person preach probably 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. One of the things I'll say about that is you mentioned the word celebrity, which is such a big deal, not just in the culture, but in the culture of the church today. And one of the things about Keller was he never left you with that air. And I don't think he ever saw himself as that. And if he ever was tempted to go down that road, I am certain that internally he had thought enough and studied the scriptures enough to know that was really going to be one of the enemy's ploys to undo him. And so I know that he fought back on that. I'm sure he had people in his life around him who helped him navigate that. First and foremost, his wife, Kathy, who you guys are both married. I am as well. And I have a wife who is like that. And that is a great gift. The Lord, I truly believe this, that the Lord gives us the spouses that we need. And I've been blessed with that, and I'm sure he was as well. So I have not met him since he became well known. And it's interesting, his main writing did not start till about 2007, which when you think about that, he really only had about 15, what does that figure to, about 15 years of publishing. And I know I handed Chris here a list of all that he's written in terms of books, not even articles and things, but just what he's written in books. And it's maybe 3 dozen. I don't know. It's very long and very prolific in his writing. But prior to that, most people did not know who he was. Now, I'm in the Presbyterian Church of America, and Tim Keller was PCA at Redeemer Church in New York City, which he founded back in the late 1980s, was PCA, part of our denomination. So we were always aware of Keller, but certainly not with what he's done. Now, I'll tell you when I met him in 1985. It was a very brief meeting, but I still remember it very clearly. I had just left Gordon Conwell Seminary. That'll figure back into our discussion a little bit later. It was 1985, and I had 2 classes left to complete that I was doing as independent studies under the, leadership of 2 of the profs up there. And so I had moved down to Philadelphia. I was doing youth ministry back where I was from and where I had grown up, right in the shadow of Westminster Theological Seminary. We lived in Glenside, Lisa and I did, with our family. And I would get away from the church when I was doing coursework, and I'd go over to the library at Westminster and hunker down in the basement there. And as many seminary libraries do, there was like a wall of faculty offices. These, as I remember them, were all glass. There weren't like solid walls, but you could see in. So I'm over there working, and there were 2 guys who were Westminster students at the time who were doing internships at our Presbyterian church. And I was assisting with the supervision of both, and both were doing their work under Tim Keller. He had gone there as first year as a practical theology professor to work alongside a man named Harvey Kahn, who, by the way, for anybody interested in urban ministry, missiology, contextualization, Harvey Kahn is phenomenal resource with what he's written. And so these guys, I knew them. They saw me, one of them saw me in the library, came down, we chatted. He says, "Hey, do you want to come meet my supervisor, my seminary supervisor for the internship?" So we got up, walked across the basement of the library, and went into this office, got to chat with Tim Keller. I don't remember a whole lot about it. I mean, he was a very humble, kind of quiet, nondescript guy. We did chat very briefly. about seminary education because he had been a grad of Gordon Conwell, quite influential in his life. Same thing for me. I was getting ready to finish up and graduate, so we had that conversation. Then we went on our ways, and it's been very interesting to see how the influences in our separate ways have been shared and a lot of crossover, which we can talk about here. But that was when I met him. Never had a conversation with him since, but certainly tracked with his ministry. And more recently, Colin Hansen recently released a book published by Zondervan called Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation. I want to talk about that at some point here. But what's really interesting about this book is it's not a biography of Keller's life. There's a lot about Keller's life in there, but it really is about the influences on him intellectually and spiritually. And I told the guys before we got on here, poor Chris here and then my wife Lisa's, I've been reading the book, have been subjected to these outbursts of excitement from me where we have these, Keller and myself, because of our paths and how similar they are. And I'm not Timothy Keller, but I am so grateful for the providence of God in giving me the influences in my life. And so this was a great book for me to read because what it did was it took me back over the last 40 to 50 years of my life. And as Hansen was listing these things that were part of Keller's life, I'm going, oh my gosh, that was part of my life as well. Or that person was in my home, or that person, I had a chance to study under that person. And I am so grateful for the providence of God and the kinds of influences that he led me to. We'll unpack that a little bit, but I want to ask you guys to just tell me a little bit about Keller's influence on your life and your ministry. Jason, you want to go first there? Talk a little bit about Keller's influence.
I think the biggest thing that stands out to me that I've thought a lot about over the last week, and I shared this with our church on Sunday morning, is just the fact that Tim Keller believed the gospel. You can tell when people truly believe the gospel. And I've been thinking a lot about this difference. There are a lot of people that believe in God. The question is not, do we believe in God? The question is, do we believe God? Do we believe that God is really real? Do we believe that the kingdom is really real? Do we believe that this gospel really unveils for us the truth of all things? And there was just this quiet rest about Keller and all that he did that just pointed to what he believed to be the durability of the gospel. He really believed the gospel was durable. And much like Paul in the Areopagus in Acts 17, he was able to highlight different cultural texts all around him all the time and be able to speak the gospel into those as if the gospel had a seat at the table. And in fact, he believed that the gospel controlled all of that. He believed that the gospel was the story of which all the rest were echoes. And it's just beautiful to hear him speak of the gospel in a way that he was just rooted in it and he believed it. And even in his final days, just the way he spoke of the kingdom and the way that he spoke of the reality that transcends death, I think captured a lot of people's hearts and, really preached the gospel even in his death. And I think that that's true of somebody who takes God at his word and somebody who really believes that the gospel is real.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that on this list of books that he's written, if you look at the last two that were published, which were published while he was dealing with pancreatic cancer, and he knew that death was looming. I mean, anybody who knows about pancreatic cancer knows that, and to last a year is a big deal. I've had 3 friends over the course of the last year and a half die from pancreatic cancer, and it is quick from diagnosis to death. And the 2 books, one was in, two of the last 3. So the first one in 2020, a book titled On Death, and then a year later, Hope in Times of Fear, the Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter. And like you said, Jason, he really, really believed that. I love what you say there. Let me just follow up with you a little bit. If you have an audience of youth workers who are listening here, and I know we have many parents who listen as well. Just a word to them on the importance, from your experience, the importance of Keller.
So I believe that there's so much negative discipleship when it comes to youth ministry. And by that, I mean, there's just so much of pressing students into a mold. There's so much of talk of what you shouldn't do, what you should stay away from, what you should flee. And certainly that's an aspect of discipleship. I mean, we're going to talk about the things that we are to flee. Paul talks about the clothing that we're to take off, even as he points us to clothing that we are to put on. And certainly that's an aspect of it. But I think that we need a better balance between negative discipleship and positive discipleship. And, this is just anecdotal on my part, but I don't see a lot of people holding up Christ as the treasure to behold for students. I don't see them holding up the kingdom to behold for students. And I think Keller really should influence us that way. When we do, like I just said, when we can rest in the reality of the gospel, we want to call students to see Jesus and pursue him. And if all we're doing is calling people to flee things, then there's not much power in that. There's no power in that. And, as intellectual as Keller was, and indeed he was, he was a powerful intellectual. It never came off as him trying to capture people's intellect. He was always trying to capture people's hearts. And he was speaking to the imagination. And I think that is a beautiful balance for us, that we can go deep in the things of God, and we can even be intellectual in the way that we talk about the things of God. But ultimately, we want people's hearts to be captured by the reality of God, by the reality of his kingdom, to see the beauty of Christ, to see the beauty of this gospel that gives a better word, despite the things that we are facing. And, that is how he has been influential in my life, in the way that I carry about being a student pastor, is to always try to balance those things. And at the end of the day, hold up hope for students to see and to hold on to and to pursue.
Yeah, I like that. And not what we're to flee from, but what we're to embrace and move towards. Kyle, what about you?
Right. Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking about, I think one of the first one of my first interactions with Tim Keller was watching a Desiring God interview on desiringgod.org, where they were just talking about Tim Keller's life. And he mentioned how a lot of people aspire to be pastors of large churches, and they have these aspirations. And Walt, I know this is something we've talked about a lot. I don't know if on the top of your head you remember, you wrote a blog post about this, something about if you seek the spotlight, it'll blind you.
Yeah, if
and
you seek the spotlight, it'll blind you.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially in the youth ministry world, a lot of people trying to do these big things. But one thing that's interesting about Tim Keller is he spent a lot of time at a small church in Virginia. I think it was named Hopewell Church. Yeah. And he spent a lot of years. And in this, I was sitting in my dorm room in college watching this interview where Tim Keller was talking about, rather than aspiring to lead a big church, he said he told younger people to go to a small church. And for years, what he did is he pastored people in a small town, and he married them and he buried them and he preached, many times. And I just remember listening to that, which is kind of countercultural advice in the Christian world. And then I compare that to one of my most recent interactions with people of Tim Keller, and that was about 2 months ago. My brother is a missionary in Mexico City, and I was down visiting him, and I was eating breakfast in this small restaurant in Mexico City, in the slums of Mexico City, with my brother, who is a missionary in Mexico City, and two of his friends who are interns with City to City, which is an organization that Keller started. And all three of them are being trained by City to City. And just thinking about, I first heard of Keller talking about going to an obscure place where no one knows who you are. And then fast forward, 10, 15 years later, I'm sitting in this small restaurant talking to these three guys who are being trained by City to City, who will go out and likely never be well-known preachers to the world like Tim Keller. Yet Keller still had an influence on them and still does even after his death. So just thinking what that means for us today just gives us great hope.
Yeah. Well, it's and his message, his posture, the way that he pursued ministry, again, was so countercultural in our celebrity-loving world, in our celebrity-loving church. As you were talking, Kyle, what came to mind is there's a contrast there between what you said about Keller and all of the press right now, that all the crazy Hillsong stuff is getting, documentaries and Netflix and this, that, and the other thing. I mean, it's like watching a soap opera, and it's embarrassing, and it's also a warning to all of us, right? I mean, I think we need to take it to heart and use it as a warning. But Keller gives us a great example because he never pursued this, and I'm thinking, as you're describing that, when he and his wife Kathy graduated from Gordon Conwell, they had no idea where they were going to go. Now, this is Tim Keller, all right? They both went and applied with the United States Postal Service to be postal carriers. And then all of a sudden, this thing came up to do 3 months at this tiny church in this chemical factory town, Hopewell, Virginia, where people were blue-collar, down-to-earth, completely opposite of, sort of his Bucknell philosophy education, living on the North Shore of Boston, as so many of us have when we were at Gordon Conwell. And he goes down there and he just learns about cross-cultural ministry. He learns about loving people. He never complained about it. He embraced it. Then he goes to Westminster. And to your point, Kyle, when you read the story of his calling to start and plant the church in New York City, which has become known as Redeemer Presbyterian Church, he fought that for a long time, to the point where he had in his mind, as he prayed, certain people that he thought should take that position, and he was working to encourage them. You need to do this. You need to start this. And then when all that falls through, somehow the Lord hits him with a clear sense of calling. And by the way, his wife pushed against that, but she eventually caved. It's a great story, and just said, you know what? If the Lord's calling him, I need to go. I mean, great. I'll say this, and this may get me to a great complementarian marriage, right? I mean, just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that was not who she was when she went to Gordon Conwell and enrolled, coming up there from Pittsburgh. She was on a fast-tracked ordination in the PCUSA, and that's a whole nother story as well. But what a beautiful, I love what you guys both brought up, because right there we could stop right now and say there's some great examples for us, not only in our posture, but in our message as well. So, hey, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to continue this conversation, because there's so many things we can talk about. And I want you to stick with us, because we're going to start to get into naming influences. As you look back over the course of your life, it's the people you spend time with, the books that you read, the media that you engage with, the kind of education that you receive and that you really seek out, that shapes us. And we can be misshapen and deformed as well, but being shaped and formed in good ways for ministry, for life, for parenting, for youth ministry. That's what we're passionate about here, and we're going to have that conversation. So stay with us. We'll be right back. CPYU has been around now for over 3 decades. Our mission remains what it has always been: to increase the ability of home and church to nurture children and teens into a lifetime of biblically faithful, whole-life Christian discipleship. We've been gearing up to continue to help you understand and respond with biblical hope to today's youth culture. I'm happy to announce that we've launched our brand new website, which can be found at cpyu.org. Visit it regularly for updated youth culture news, access to our growing database of free resources for parents and youth workers, and to hear our podcasts. Be sure to bookmark cpyu.org and use it in your efforts to disciple your children and teens.
And we're back here on this episode of Youth Culture Matters. Thankful for CPYU, our CPYU podcast network. And we're talking about Tim Keller today. And Walt, I know you are excited about this book that Colin Hansen just put out. And even that is just interesting, how Colin has worked for so long with the Gospel Coalition, which Tim Keller has co-founded with Don Carson. But this new book that came out recently, I will confess, since we have been recording this episode, I went on Amazon and bought it, and it will be coming. And I'm interested. I know one of my coworkers, our college pastor, Bruce, as soon as he read this a couple of weeks ago, he was like, everyone, you got to read this. But I know you've been enjoying it. And I was just wondering, as we're thinking about influences, Walt, I know this has just sparked a lot in your mind, thinking about influences of Tim Keller and yourself. And I was just wondering maybe what you could share with our listeners today.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I got to the end of the book, I should have read this first, right? Because, you're thinking you're going to read a biography. And I should have known from the subtitle of the book is Spiritual and Intellectual Formation, but there wasn't enough of a clue there from me, being not a very smart person, to get this. But I get to the postscript right after the epilogue. I mean, this is one of those books with epilogue, postscript, post, all that. But Hansen writes this: I never found a parallel among biographies for this book, which has explored the influences on more than the influence of our subject. And I think that's why it gave me great hope, just a sense of thankfulness. And I actually, as I was doing this, I would go back to inside the front cover. I had a pen with me, so I'm underlining things. Every time I came across a name, every time I came across a book, every time I came across something that's part of our, when I say our, I mean my and Tim Keller's shared spiritual and I would say intellectual DNA, if I can use that term about myself, intellectual, but because I do love to read and I do love to learn. It is amazing. It was amazing. So I'm constantly writing like, oh, man, there's another name. Oh, man, there's another book. Oh, man, there's another writer. There's another place. And so I made this list. So I'm going to rifle through this really quick. And the reason I want to share this is not only because it excites me and it's going to be very therapeutic and joy-giving to do. So I apologize for that. But when we talk about influences, everyone who's listening, make note of some of these names. Make note of some of these books, because if you want to know how Keller, by the providence of God, became who he was, and I will say this, it's helped me understand as I've looked back with great joy over the providence of God in my own life. I've seen, and this has really brought together and helped gel for me, the unity of these influences that have left me where I am now, and I want to continue on. There were other things in that book that I read about that I'm not familiar with that I'm going to grab, and I'm going to get into these things. So, and I broke this down like to periods of my life, so bear with me, guys, but simple things, all right? So, like, in my childhood, my dad was a pastor. We were in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, which is right in the shadow of Westminster Seminary, and, Keller lived there. I've said in past podcasts before that if you ever watch the Goldbergs on television, that's Jenkintown, that tiny little town. They were 2 blocks from us where we lived. But during my childhood, my dad was a very, very bright man in the New Testament and a Greek scholar. Got to know lots of people. He was educated at Reformed Episcopal Seminary, then also at Princeton. But I'm going to give you some, and then he went on to teach. I'm going to give you some names here that are just amazing that were part of Keller's life. So Bruce Metzger, the scholar at Princeton, who my dad was talking about all the time. My dad knew. My dad would confer with. Center for Urban Theological Studies. When I was in middle school, my dad started to teach there. That actually grew out of a combination of Geneva College and Westminster Seminary. He taught New Testament there. Bill Crispin, who's mentioned in the book, was a friend of my dad's and someone that I knew as well who ran that. Conwell School of Theology, which in 1969 merged with Gordon Divinity School and moved up to the North Shore of Boston. My dad taught there. That was the theological school. Most people don't know this. At Temple University, it was the graduate theological school at Temple. Stuart Barton Babbage, an Australian theologian who I've quoted here on the podcast before, who I remember coming to our home. Philip Edgecombe Hughes, who taught at Westminster as well, was from over the pond, and most people would know him from his commentary on Hebrews. He was in our house constantly. In fact, my mom was just reminding me that I told Philip Hughes' wife one day when she asked me as a little boy, do you love Jesus? I said, no, I hate Jesus. And, of course, there's more to the story on that, but that really rattled her. Harvey Kahn, who I mentioned earlier, who's a practical theology guy at Westminster. Ray Dillard, who taught at Westminster, passed away several years ago. And then even Pine Brook. The Kellers went to Pine Brook, which at the time, I think it still is, it was a Bible fellowship camp. Kyle, were you ever there? Did you ever hear of the Pine Brook?
No, I've never been to Pine Brook.
Yeah, on retreats and things. So that played into it. Is that
outside of Philly somewhere?
Well, it's up in the Poconos. Yeah, so it's up up around Stroudsburg, that area. I couldn't get there today, but I was there a lot when I was a kid. So the influence of that, the Bible Fellowship Church, and then, when I was at Geneva, R.C. Sproul, I got to sit under Sproul. He came and did some training for a small group of us for a couple of weeks. One year, James Boyce, the same thing. Keller cites Francis Schaeffer and Labrie, and then also Hans Ruckmacher, who was a contemporary of Schaeffer. His book, Modern Art and the Death of the Culture, is one that I've quoted for years here at CPYU. And I remember meeting Ruckmacher, hosting him for lunch one time, he and I together, when I was a student at Geneva. Gerhardus Voss, who influenced Meredith Kline, who was a huge influence on Keller at at Gordon Conwell. Gerhardus Voss wrote biblical theology, and that's really what was behind everything we learned at Geneva. And then his son, J.G., was getting ready to retire, was an elderly man, and I got to know him when I went to Geneva. That was his last year, but he stuck around during my 4 years and was on campus, and I got to spend some time with him, J.G. Voss. So my Geneva things. But then my early days of ministry, when I graduated from Geneva and went to Johnstown, John Guest is mentioned several times, an Englishman who came over with Young Life and did concerts during the 1960s where young people would come to faith. He had a band at the time. He came over then eventually and settled in the Pittsburgh area, had this vision of Pittsburgh becoming a city as known for God as it was for steel. That's where Kathy Keller grew up. And so Guest was an influence in her life when she was involved in Young Life in Pittsburgh. Dora Hillman, who I met, who was an older philanthropist, a widow, who donated out of her abundance of wealth all the land in Ligonier for the Ligonier Valley Study Center. Of course, R.C. Sproul. John Gerstner is mentioned, and I had a chance to sit for a week with John Gerstner under his I got some good stories about him, too. The Coalition for Christian Outreach that I worked with for 3 years right out. And then when Keller lived in Johnstown, which I did not know, where my wife is from and where I did ministry, this tiny little dying steel town, and lots of stories. I shared this with Kyle about driving over the Laurel Mountain, which was significant in my life. Then I went up to Gordon Conwell, and I think about some of my classmates and professors. So my classmates, guys like Mark Dever, Mark Acuff, Doug Calhoun, Pete Scazzaro, John Van Meerbeck, Tim Tennant. These guys have gone on to do some amazing things, and I remember all of our lunches together, either laughing about life, talking about theology and ministry, or just having a good time talking about sports, that kind of thing. And then the professors, Bob Pazmino, who's written a tremendous book I recommend to youth workers called Foundational Issues in Christian Education. He was part of Keller's friend inner circle, as was Doug and Adele Calhoun, which I was unaware of at the time. Richard Lovelace, Dynamics of Spiritual Life, a book I just reread that was kind of the book, sort of like Carl Truman's, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self a couple of years ago was the book of the year. Lovelace's Dynamics of Spiritual Life in the late 70s was being read everywhere, and I just reread that. By the way, Lovelace, the absent-minded church history professor who, if folks are interested, it's a tough read. I just gave it to a friend of mine to read who studied under Lovelace. It's a book by his son called Scattershot, which is a memoir subtitled Memoir of My Bipolar Family. Lovelace was, and it's very sad in so many ways, but just a genius and a spiritual giant. Roger Nicole, I can't say enough about Nicole. By the way, I'll say to you guys, Keller talks about Nicole and Nicole's influence. Nicole was a Baptist. He went down and taught at RTS in Orlando after he left Gordon Conwell. And I had Nicole for systematic theology, just a dear, sweet man, and spent a lot of time with him personally, one-on-one. Just a godly, sweet man. And Keller, they talk about the fact that the way Nicole taught theology was he would lay out, he would come up with, he would talk about a doctrine, so let's say baptism, and he'd lay out all the views very fairly. He'd say why he chose the view he chose. And Keller says that more Baptists came to Gordon Conwell. There were a load of Baptists who came to Gordon Conwell, and after taking his systematic theology class and learning about baptism, he explained paedobaptism so well that they became paedobaptists. You guys have a response to that, or you two are Baptists? Okay, silence, just laughs, smiles. It's not happening, is it?
I do have a question, not about that.
Yeah.
This is so helpful, Walt, as you're mentioning all these these are people, and some of these people are less known, some of them are more known. But I'm just wondering and then you keep going because I know you have more, but for our listeners who are saying maybe they're not even very familiar with you, Walt Mueller, and then maybe they're not very familiar with Tim Keller or these names, how would you encourage our listeners just to help them realize, I mean, there was a wealth of people, we say it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
It also took a village in order to influence Tim Keller, who has influenced millions of people. So how would you just encourage our listeners who might not be familiar with these names on why we're actually even having this conversation right now?
Well, these are names of people who God has used in mighty ways. Faithful servants of Christ, most of them scholars, many of them scholars and practitioners, many of them just practitioners, who are wise, who have leaned into, and I'll go back to what Jason said at the top, just gospel-centered ministry. I mean, we get into so much that sidetracks us. I mean, just the demise of theology and biblical theology, the rise of consumerism and the culture of consumerism in the church. These people were awesome. And I'll tell you, when and you guys have heard me talk about Gordon Conwell before, off the microphone. When I was there at Gordon Conwell, it was ground zero for evangelical theological education. And you would walk onto that campus, and it was, I hate to use the term magical, because I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression there, but there was something happening there that you could almost cut it with a knife. I mean, I'm going up there in a week and a half with Duffy for an Adonis Video for our Doctor of Ministry cohort, and I can't wait. It's like being a kid before Christmas. As soon as I drive onto that campus, something is happening, and it reminds me of that. So does that answer your question, Kyle? These guys are
yeah, for sure. Because I'm just trying to think about, like, it's amazing for all of us to realize the influences we have in our lives.
Yeah.
And I know as you're mentioning this, even thinking how you had conversations when you were a little boy with some of these people. I just think it's such an encouragement, especially, the title of this podcast, Youth Culture Matters. The world that our boys and girls are growing up in today is very different from the world that Tim Keller grew up in, but the gospel has not changed.
Yeah.
So I just think it's an encouragement for us to be positive influences, not in the world, positive influence, but actually like gospel biblical influences, because the next Tim Keller might be in our youth group right
exactly.
now,
you don't
might
know.
be in our house.
Yeah. And by the way, with that, like when you go back and as Hansen writes about Keller as a boy, or Keller at Buck, he was very unassuming. It seems like he was an absolute introvert. There was nothing about him, that was, would wow people. He just was earnest in his desire to know truth. Jason, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say just about influences and how we assess the influences that we take on in our lives. What you're speaking to there at the end. We live in a culture where we tend to just gather into bubbles, and it becomes an echo chamber very quickly, where all of the influences in my life are already affirming things that I believe, things that I think. And as you're listing Keller's influences, I mean, you see such variety there, and you see that all of these influences were helping Keller become a good thinker, become a good theologian. And I think, especially for student ministry leaders and other people in ministry, we need to be careful not to just get into a bubble, that we are hearing the arguments of those who may disagree with us in matters of doctrine, matters of, the conclusions and these other things. For me, I think Keller was a little outside of my bubble, but I appreciate the way that he challenged me in the ways that I thought through things. And, I feel like my conclusions I can hold with greater confidence because I have heard really well articulated arguments by other people who may disagree with me. And so I think there are two sides to the coin. We want faithful influences, but we also want to expand our horizons a little bit to faithfulness outside of what we may already have as conclusions. And, that's striking me as you're giving that list there and just reminding me of that.
In response to that, just a couple of thoughts. One is, when I first read it, I was a little put off in that Colin Hansen, and when I got the book, I went right to the chapters on Gordon Conwell because I'm thinking, okay, this is my world, right? And he refers in the book to Gordon Conwell as a quote-unquote smorgasbord seminary. And initially I'm thinking, okay, that's a negative moniker, right? The good thing was, and I think he casts it in a brighter, more helpful light, and it's what I experienced as well. It's just what you're talking about there, Jason, that people agreed on the essentials. Now, there were a couple of times, and this is mentioned in the book, where there were a couple of professors there who were wavering. And if you talk to people who were there before I was, and even in my first year, a professor was encouraged to leave, and that was a tough thing. But for the most part, there was agreement on the essentials, and that really did stretch us and give us the best of both of all worlds and keep us out of the bubbles. And by the way, as you were saying that, I think about when we teach our students as parents or as youth workers about choosing your friends wisely. Like I think about Will Smith, who said, take a look at your 5 closest friends. That's who you are. And of course, that runs back when we go to Proverbs 13:20. I'd rather lean into that than Will Smith. But, he who walks with the wise grows wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm. I'm going to say this about youth ministry, that I think one of the big mistakes and errors and missteps we've been making in the world of youth ministry is that we jump into the bubble just of other youth workers. And sometimes the highest level theologians that we ever expose ourselves to, the highest level thinkers that we expose ourselves to, are other youth workers. And let me just say, because I've been in youth ministry, we're not going the bar's not set very high there. Right. And I think that it undermines what it is that we're doing, and we have to work to live. This is why I push for higher education. This is why I push for seminary education. It's the very thing you're talking about, Jason.
Yeah. And well, I want to echo that, and then also turn it back to you, because I know you have more that you want.
Just a couple. Just
more
a
of these
few.
influence you want to mention. But I do want to echo that, especially for those who are listening, who are trying to think through, maybe in your own church, if your kids are in a youth ministry, or maybe you are a youth worker listening. This is why seminary education is not the enemy of youth ministry, right? And I think sometimes we even get caught up, maybe not even using the word seminary, but just training in general. That was part of Tim Keller's DNA, right? He wanted to train others to do the work of ministry, and I think it's just worth mentioning. But, Walt, please list some more of these names, because I know you're excited about this, and I'm excited to hear who they are.
Yeah, I'm almost through, because we're going to get to some more books here that are really good, that may surprise some people.
Yep.
I want to finish up with Gordon Conwell, because I mentioned Roger Nicole last, but Harold Ockenga, the first president, Gordon Conwell up there, just deeply committed to missions, an icon in the evangelical world in the mid-20th century and beyond. He had stepped down from the presidency right before I arrived, but it was my privilege to have lunch with him one day, and it's still up there. There's a kind of a hidden room on the 3rd floor of the Academic Center. I'll be there in a couple of weeks, where it's Ockenga's library. And I got to tell you, I love to scan the books on that shelf. I'll never get through them all, but just looking at the titles, getting ideas. Harold Lindsell, who was the chairman of the board at the time. Meredith Klein, I mentioned earlier, who had followed Gerhardus Voss and had a deep influence on Keller, who was up there. He wrote a book called By Oath Consigned, and that's one that's highly recommended, along with Voss's Biblical Theology, if you want to dig deeper into the flow of redemptive history in the Scriptures, which is really, that was my Geneva College education. That was my Coalition for Christian Outreach training, with Gerstner, Sproul, and others. Dutch Neo-Calvinism, is what it's called. Don't get lost in the word there, but if you can read some of those, it's just really speaks to all of life. And then Elizabeth Elliot, which, I got to read you something from her, because this was, and this is great. I heard this story before, and if any of you ever had the opportunity to visit or to meet Elizabeth Elliot, I have. She lived right up there by the seminary, and if you don't know her story, Google her, Elizabeth Elliot. Quite a human being. Her graduate of Wheaton College, her first husband was martyred by the Alca Indians, along with 4 others way back in the 1950s. That's just an iconic mission story. You should be aware of that. But so she lived. Her husband was a professor. Her second husband was a professor at the time, and he passed away while she was up there from cancer. And Kathy Keller talks about this class. All right, now Kathy Keller again did a shift in her understanding of the place of women in the church. And I'm just going to share with you what she writes here and what she says in Colin Hansen's book about Elizabeth Elliot. Kathy Keller recalled a class when, quote, Betty Elliot walked up and down the aisles, listing her qualifications to be ordained. Now this is Elizabeth Elliot. If you're around her, she could grate on you, all right? She kind of had a very edgy, in-your-face, no-nonsense personality. She says, I am better versed in Hebrew and Greek than any of you, as well as multiple other languages. I have more communication skills than do any of you, male or female. I am comfortable speaking in front of large crowds and skillful in one-to-one conversations. I have a depth of understanding of God born of suffering that few of you will match. My giftedness is far beyond most of you. I mean, it sounds so arrogant, but she was making a point here. And yet God has not called me to use those gifts in an ordained capacity. Does that mean they are of less worth? I know that not to be true. Calling is different from giftedness or even desire. And that really was influential in Kathy Keller's life. So that was Gordon Conwell. I left there, went back to the Philly area, New Life Presbyterian Church, where Tim and Kathy Keller, they were there. I was there 85 to 90. They were there. They moved there 85 to 89, attended New Life Presbyterian Church, which was 2 miles from where we lived. We did our church did combined youth ministry activities every couple of months with New Life. In fact, it was funny. Jack Miller, who was pastoring at the time, and who, by the way, I'm going to recommend this book because if you want to know the DNA of Keller, read Jack Miller's book, C. John Miller. It's called C is an initial, C period, John Miller is on the cover of the book. The Heart of a Servant Leader. I read that a few years ago during COVID. A phenomenal book, and you can find a lot about Keller in there because he sat under that influence. But there's a great story told of how Jack Miller would go out on the street corners in Jenkintown, and he would talk, to the drug addicts and the motorcycle gang members. And in fact, one of them came to faith, married his daughter, and then was his successor at New Life Presbyterian Church. And they didn't name him, but it's my buddy who was the youth pastor there that I worked with all the time, Angelo Giuliani, whose wife Barbara is the subject of Jack Miller's and Rosemarie Miller's book, Come Back Barbara, which is a great book for parents of prodigals. I can't recommend that highly enough. CCEF, he was involved with CCEF, Christian Counseling Education Foundation. We're all familiar with them. And then Harvest USA, Ministry to the Sexually Broken. And then beyond that, just some other things. Richard Lentz, who was a great influence on Keller with his book, The Fabric of Theology. He is someone I've gotten to know who was a theology prof up at Gordon Conwell after I was there. And then some other influences. I'll end with this, all right? So make note of these names, and I'm going to mention some things. These are shared influences that, man, I embrace these people with a passion and try to read everything they write. So J.I. Packer, John Stott, Francis Schaeffer, Paul Little. I'll give you these names, Chris. You're going to be here for weeks putting this down on the show notes. And then Martin Lloyd-Jones. I mean, those are great. And then the Puritans. Keller discovered the Banner of Truth publications. I think about Banner of Truth because next week they'll be in Elizabethtown here for their annual conference. I'm going to mention 4, and I've read all 4 of these guys and continue to read and reread. Richard Baxter and the Reformed Pastor, Thomas Brooks and his book, The Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices, so good. William Gurnall, The Christian in Complete Armor, and then John Newton's, I think it's Selected Letters of John Newton, which I've read. So it's great, great stuff. Can I share, before we take a break, I want to share. Kyle, did you want to say something? Okay. I want to share one more story before we take a break from the book because I think this is great, and I love this because I knew this guy. And you guys are going to love this story because this, and Keller would tell this story. It's really about the providence of God. So let me set it up here. That Keller's at Gordon Conwell, and one of the students is Mike Ford, and Mike Ford happens to be the son of the president of the United States at the time, Gerald Ford. I got to know Mike Ford after Gordon Conwell. He was not there when I was, but we overlapped and worked together on the staff of the Coalition for Christian Outreach. So Mike's a great guy. I think he's still down at Wake Forest University as the dean of students. So Keller was very excited about this guy named Andrew Lincoln, who was going to come and be a professor at Gordon Conwell. And for some reason, he could not get his visa. And so he was expected to miss the entire school year, and Keller was going to miss having this guy as a professor. So one of the guys, William Nigel Kerr, who was one of my church history profs at Gordon Conwell, who happened to be the dean at the time, was asking the students to pray that God would make a way for Andrew Lincoln, to get his visa to come and to teach. So here's what Keller writes. Keller writes this: "At the last minute, somebody cut through the red tape. He came, and I fell under his influence. Do you know why the red tape was cut? The dean of my seminary was on his knees praying about how we were going to get this guy over here when Mike Ford, Gerald Ford's son, walked in and asked the dean what he was praying for. Mike Ford was a student at the seminary at the time. Do you know why Mike Ford was able to cut the red tape? Because his father was the president. Do you know why his father was the president? Because Nixon had resigned. Do you know why Nixon resigned? Because of the Watergate scandal. Do you know why there was a Watergate scandal? Because one day a guard noticed in the Watergate building a particular door ajar that should have been closed." Now, Keller tells that as an example of God's providence and how God works through circumstances. And I love that, because that forces us all to go back and look at our lives and just see how God's providence works. But he just connected those dots. It was a beautiful thing. So, yeah, well, let's take another break. We're going to come back, finish up. I know we just got a couple of minutes before Kyle has to run, and we're gonna finish up with a couple last questions and thoughts and some recommendations. So stay with us. Here at CPYU, we're excited to announce a brand new resource that we've created to help parents understand and respond to the many changing realities in today's youth culture. It's our brand new, free, and downloadable weekly CPYU Parent Prompt. Put together in an easy-to-use format, each week's CPYU Parent Prompt will address one topic. It will explain what the world is saying about the particular trend, give you an understanding of how God's Word speaks to that trend, and will offer you questions and discussion prompts to use with your teenagers as you help them see how the Christian faith speaks to that particular cultural reality. You will find all of our CPYU parent prompts on our website at cpyu.org. Well, I want to remind all of our listeners that everything we mention here on this podcast in terms of names, and it's overwhelming in this particular podcast, I'm sure, for Chris Wagner here, but he is going to list on the show notes, the player notes, beneath the player, the show notes for this particular episode of Youth Culture Matters, which you can find on our website at cpyu.org. He will list and put links up to these names, to a lot of the resources in the books and things. We're going to add to that right now. We're going to burden Chris even more, and he's going to add to his burden, because I want to ask Chris and Jason and Kyle the question: what do you recommend as we end the podcast? Is there a particular sermon or talk that Keller has done? And I'm telling you, there are hundreds of these things that you can access online. I mean, my wife, when she goes out to walk every day, she's listening to 2 or 3 Keller sermons consistently, and I don't think she's exhausted things yet. And then also maybe a book from Keller that's really been helpful to you. And if I can say to Jason and Kyle, we talk a lot about setting the bar high for our kids. Would you recommend as well a book that would be a good book to give to maybe high school students? Because I think these things are accessible. So I'll let whoever wants to begin on this. Let me go to Chris first, because we talked when we were off about a sermon series that I find extremely valuable.
Yeah, I don't even know what the sermon series is titled, but it's a sermon series about marriage.
I will find that and give it to you, because I have it.
Yeah, and it eventually became the material for the book that he released, The Meaning of Marriage, but the sermon series dates, I think, all the way back to 1991.
91, it was one of his first Redeemer series.
It's 9 or 10 sermons long, so I've actually never read the book, The Meaning of Marriage, but I've listened to the sermon series 3 or 4 times all the way through. Highly recommend it, especially for me. At the time, I was still fairly new in my marriage, and it was just super helpful in thinking through what a healthy marriage looks like, what a godly husband looks, what my role as a godly husband looks like. So much packed into that helpful sermon series. So that's one I'd recommend.
You know what, Chris, with that, I'm just thinking here, I think maybe that would be a good one to listen with our high school seniors.
Absolutely.
Sit with our high school seniors and juniors maybe and listen to that and process that. So, Jason or Kyle?
I'll go. So as far as sermons go, not a series, but Keller preaches a 2-part sermon on Romans 7 that has, I love to listen to it. I've gone back and listened to those sermons a couple of times since then. And he talks about our relation to our flesh, Paul's consternation there in that chapter. And, that's where Paul says, very famously that the very thing I want to do, I don't do. The very thing I don't want to do, I do. Who will save me from this body of flesh? And Tim Keller uses the illustration of the short work, Jekyll and Hyde, to talk about our relationship to the flesh. And it just really opened up for me in new ways, understanding, the hope that we have now, even though we continue to battle with this flesh. That flesh is no longer indicative of who I am in Christ. It is now an alien force within me, and the Spirit is greater, and I already have victory over it. And just the confidence that those messages gave me in the gospel, to know that the Spirit is alive in me and active in me, those just made a great impression on me. And as far as a book goes, of course, Prodigal God, I think that it's just as timely now as when he wrote it, especially in our culture where we see this interplay, this posture from the elder brother to the younger brother, I think play out in even more profound ways than in the day that Keller wrote the book. And just how timely that message is, I think, for our culture, and just how powerful the gospel is to save all of us as sinners. And we all need to understand that even in our self-righteousness and our moralism, we are in need of the gospel. Just a beautiful book, and one that I hope many will read in response to who is this Tim Keller guy that just died. I hope many will be driven to that. And for student ministry, you mentioned the meaning of marriage for seniors. We have put together a curriculum, discipleship pathway for our parents that we recommend resources all the way through a student's journey through middle school and high school. And on that list, there's one resource for every semester for each grade. And we have Keller's The Reason for God, I think, for sophomores in the fall of their sophomore year. And then we have The Meaning of Marriage in the fall of seniors of the senior year in high school to read with their parents. So we've just heard great feedback from parents who have read that book with their kids, both of those books with their kids, and engaged in conversations. And I think Keller does that. He writes in such a way that it elicits conversations between students and parents. And so those two resources, I can't recommend enough for that.
Jason, would you share that document with us? Is that one that we could
Absolutely.
pass? Okay, yeah. Chris will get that from me. We'll post that. That sounds like a great resource. Kyle.
Yeah, when I think about resources we'd want our high school students to watch or listen to, my favorite Tim Keller clip, I posted it on social media the other day when all the news was happening about him passing away. If you go on YouTube and just search "The Bible is Not About You," Tim Keller, it's part of a bigger sermon, but he's pointing to the fact that so often we read stories and in church and Sunday school, David and Goliath, and we hear this message that you are David, you are David and you're going to go fight. And he just flips that upside down in this short clip, which I believe is part of a bigger sermon. But that's also, he mentions, that's my favorite part of his preaching book that came out several years ago, which when we think about Tim Keller teaching on preaching, so many people try to replicate Tim Keller and they do a horrible job. I don't know if you guys ever saw several years ago, there was on social media a picture of his notes he took into the pulpit. And it was just like, you couldn't even like understand what was happening here. So when, you're trying to learn to preach like Tim Keller, that doesn't always make sense. But in his preaching book, he discusses what he does in this short clip, "The Bible is Not About You," where rather than trying to put ourselves in the stories of the Old Testament, we look for where Jesus is, and that Jesus is the true and better Jonah. Jesus is the true and better Adam. So that's what I would recommend for students. But for church leaders, one article that just I've heard over the years occasionally, I just found it again this morning and printed it out. Redeemer City to City put it out. It's called "Leadership and Church Size Dynamics." And it's about a 10-page article that, some people get up in arms about contextualization and church size, but Keller has this article that I've heard referenced throughout the years, which just helps us think through how a church of 40 will operate differently than a church of 200, which will operate differently than a church of 800, and so forth. And I think for anyone in ministry, even if you're not the senior pastor of a church, it's helpful to read an article like this. And I know Chris will put it in our show notes, just to help us think through how size of our gatherings does affect how we do. It doesn't affect what we do, because we're still going to preach the gospel. We're still going to pray. We're still going to evangelize. But we do need to think through the setting. And I think in our youth ministry world, we have a healthy pushback on numbers and using numbers to measure success. However, I do think we do need to realize how the number of students in our room does affect not what we do, but sometimes how we do it. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Man, how do we narrow it down and how do we choose? And that's one of the beautiful things about this. And I'm going to say this, man, the thing that stands out about Keller is his humility. I mean, it was genuine and real. And just to pray for that. Let me mention, too, as we end, and I put a stamp of approval on not that matters, but on everything you guys have mentioned, really everything on the list of everything he's written. But 2 of his devotionals, The Songs of Jesus, a year of daily devotions in the Psalms, and then the one that I'm going through right now with a group on our Facebook, CPYU Together in the Word Facebook group. And by the way, anybody wants to get in there, just get on Facebook, look for CPYU Together in the Word, and I'll ask to be admitted to that group. We'll get you in. We're looking this year at God's Wisdom for Navigating Life, a year of daily devotions in the book of Proverbs. And this is my 3rd time going through that particular devotional, always finding something new. Boy, the scriptures are just a treasure chest. And one of the things I appreciate so much about Keller is modeling how to dig deep into the chest. And it's bottomless, And Keller's been so good at that. So, look, what a great conversation. I really appreciate all you guys. We're grateful for Tim Keller, and I'm grateful for guys like you who have a high respect for a man who just loved the Lord with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength, modeled humility so well, used the gifts of his intellect and his brain, thought a good thinker. I just pray that all of us would jump into that ourselves, and I think a lot of transformation would start to take place, keeping Jesus as Lord and in front of everything. So, Kyle, I hope you have a great day. Jason, thanks for joining us. Chris, I'll see you when we log off. I'll be helping Chris, I think, pull some of this stuff together. But for the rest of you, thanks for joining us, and stick around, because pretty soon you'll be hearing another new episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.